This is the Distinctly Detroit podcast, the only pod that explores why one wants to be in the D. I am your host, Fyodor Ship III, the director of the University of Michigan Detroit Center. Join me as I interview students, scholars, leaders, and innovators about living, working, and loving in Detroit. Today we are joined by a reporter, editor, and author. She has worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Philadelphia Daily News, and the New York Daily News. She moved to Detroit in 2014 and founded Chalk Beat Detroit, a nonprofit education news organization designed to untangle the complexities of school politics in Detroit, giving the people a voice. She is a University of Michigan alumna and the author of The Pages in Between. The DDP welcomes NBC News reporter Erin Einhorn. Welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and we're sorry for not telling you it was on video, but you look great, and we're glad to have you here. Curious, where are you originally from?
I'm originally from Oakland County.
Okay.
I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit.
Okay, I thought you were from the area.
Yeah.
I couldn't find that exactly
Oh,
in
right.
your bio stuff, but I was like, I remember we met before, and you're originally from the area. So what led you to move to Detroit?
Well, I was, I grew up in the Detroit area. I went to Michigan, and
Go
then
Blue.
I go blue, and then I lived in Philadelphia. I lived in New York. I was gone for 19 years, and I kept paying attention to Detroit. I kept watching what was happening in Detroit. I kept, so in 2014, Detroit was actually in bankruptcy, and it just seemed. It seemed like there was, I had actually been involved in a group of, we called ourselves Detroit expats. So I was a bunch of us who were in New York it was actually a Passover Seder that I was at in New York City. And we were all from Detroit in various ways, and we'd all ended up there.
That's cool.
And we were all just talking about what it meant for Detroit that we were all from the area and none of us lived here. Yeah. And we were all talking about how many of our friends from high school and college had left and were living in New York or LA or San Francisco or Chicago, some other place, and talking about what that meant for Detroit in terms of philanthropy, in terms of talent, in terms of knowledge, in terms of investment. And so we were talking about what would it look like to try to, gather the, resources of some of the Detroit expat community and redirect that toward Detroit. And so we had come here. I came here with a group of us, and I think it was like 2009, to meet with local folks about if we were to found this organization, what should it do? Should it raise money? Should it, raise capital? Should it raise, we ultimately ended up doing we were actually told there's plenty of philanthropy in Detroit, and we were told that what was needed was more professional services and things like that. And so we ended up creating this remote volunteer program where if you were an attorney, you could volunteer for a Detroit organization that needed legal advice or marketing skills or things like that. And we so just through that, I had been spending some time in Detroit. I'd been thinking about Detroit, and it just really felt like a place where people were invested in the city. People really cared about it. I felt when I was here on those, visits that if you lived in Detroit, you could be a part of something, in a way that, I loved living in New York. I loved Philadelphia. They were cities where a lot of things were happening. But I felt like I was a consumer of those things, that I would just kind of absorb them. I would get to I would show up at, this thing's happening at this time, I'd show up for that thing. Yeah. But it felt like in Detroit, people were building something, and people were, the folks who were here in 2009, had been here through a lot of challenges, through a lot of really tough years, and they were here because they believed in it, and because they believed in the city and its future. And it was just something that really drew me. I wanted to be a part of something too, and I felt like this was where I belonged. So that's why And I was living in an 800 square foot apartment with a baby and a toddler and a husband, and, that was suboptimal. So,
As you mentioned, though, you've worked in some really major markets, and how has Detroit been different from your other beats?
I mean, Detroit, in some ways, what's happening in New York, what's happening in Philadelphia are very similar to what's happening in Detroit, and in some ways they're completely different. You have, a city, a lot of the issues a lot of the challenges facing cities that have to do with economic disinvestment and, conflict, issues with racial inequity, issues with, obviously like gentrification, things like that. There's some common themes that you'll find, pretty much in any older American city. But Detroit. Detroit is such a unique place anyway. There's very few places that are like Detroit. Like something like gentrification looks extremely different here than it does in New York. It just everything plays out very differently, and the depth of the disinvestment and the racial disparities and the economic disparities and the sort of the consequences of the segregation and all of that just became so much deeper here. And so the challenges are so much greater in terms of how to, bring Detroit back to where it should be, equitably. So, yeah. I'm rambling. I apologize.
No, you're fine. Yeah. You're fine. So, what has been what could be considered a surprise for you since you've been back in the area, or since you've been working in the area?
A surprise for me?
Yeah. What have you found? Like, what has surprised you about the city and the goings on?
Well, I will say that when I was sitting in my apartment in Brooklyn and sort of looking at, I could live in Detroit, I had this idea that that the cost of living was lower here, and that in Detroit, I'd get so much space, I could, and in reality, it isn't true, right? Like you get to Detroit and, you need a car to get around because the transit system's broken, and then you got to get car insurance for that car, and then, you got to replace the tires every couple of weeks in the winter because the roads are broken, and, so many, and even things like, wanting to, you got to drive to the suburbs to buy certain things, or you got to, and so there's just certain, the cost of living here is much higher than I thought it would be. And, and to some extent, some of the city services are still, they're better than they were when I moved here in 2014, but, some of the city services obviously are still not where they should be. And a lot of stuff just doesn't work, a lot of stuff's still just broken.
Need some work, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what do people get wrong about Detroit?
What do people get
nationally
wrong about Detroit nationally? I think when you see the national narrative about Detroit, it falls into these you'll see these stories about, the Detroit comeback, and it'll be pictures of the downtown or the Whole Foods, and then you get the other kind of Detroit story that is sort of this there's two Detroits, you have white Detroit and black Detroit, or rich Detroit and poor Detroit, and and there's not two Detroits. There's 1,000 Detroits. There's 200,000 Detroits. There's 1,000,000 Detroits. There's so many. This is a city of so many different neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And within each neighborhood, each block is so different. And so it's really hard to make any kind of blanket statement about a city that is this big and this vast and this diverse, and faces so many different kinds of challenges in different parts of the city. And so I think that, it's probably true of any city that you can't really make some kind of blanket statement about what its essence is. But, there's just so many different parts about Detroit that make it very, that I think people get it wrong a lot.
Because it's a lot to get wrong. Yeah.
It's a lot to get wrong.
I get it. What led you to focus your reporting on education?
Well, I covered education in New York.
Okay.
I had covered. So when I worked for the New York Daily News, my first beat there was the New York City public school system, which is the largest public school system in the country. So I got really interested, and I really enjoyed covering education because when you cover education, you're never covering just education,
No.
right? You're covering economics and finance and equity and race and religion
Politics.
and culture and unions and politics and labor and government, and it's so many, and it's like it's really honestly covering a political campaign. And especially at the time when I was covering schools in New York, it was sort of the center of a lot of like the charter schools versus, a lot of those sorts of tensions. And so I just really enjoyed that beat. And then when I moved to Detroit, I wanted to write for national publications about Detroit, and most of the journalists here who were doing that work were obviously covering the bankruptcy because that was huge, and they were covering blight because that was huge. They were covering housing because it was so obvious. You would drive around the streets of Detroit and you'd see blighted housing, and so you would want to write about it. And nobody was really covering the schools in any kind of significant, for the national media. I mean, obviously the Free Press had some education reporters, although, the Free Press at one point I think had 8 education reporters covering schools across the state. And by 2014, when I moved here, I think it was down to 2, with one covering like Detroit schools and one covering the whole other rest of the state. Yeah. And I moved here with, as I said, a baby and a toddler, right? And I moved into the city, and I was determined to find a way to, find a quality education for my children in this city. And I knew that the schools were extremely challenged. And I was just trying to navigate the school system for my own family. And I would Google a school, and I couldn't tell if it was even still open. So many schools had shut down in such a short, under emergency management, so many schools had shut down in such a short fashion that I couldn't even figure out what was open and what was closed, because like the website sometimes was still up.
Yeah.
And then, like there was the EAA, and there were charters, and there were district schools, and I just didn't understand the difference. And I would Google stuff, and I would look stuff up in the papers, and there just wasn't very much coverage. And it was really very, very difficult to sort of navigate it for my own purposes. And I was like, well, this isn't right. Because like in New York, there's all these different news sites that specifically cover schools. And there was one where you could put in any school in this, and there was at the time 1,600 schools in New York City. And you could look up any one of them. And there was this website where you could look up the school and see not just like the test scores and the demographics, you could see like almost like Yelp reviews, of the school. Okay. And there'd be like a little narrative, and a reporter had gone out and visited the school and interviewed teachers and interviewed parents and wrote, oh, this is a small school with this history. And I thought, I'm here in this city. Detroit has more school choice than almost any other city in the country. I mean, you could go to, any given parent in the city of Detroit could send their child potentially to, if they had transportation, potentially, hundreds of schools, right? You can go into the suburbs, you can go to the charters, and yet, how do you make those decisions if you don't have any informational resources? Which is ultimately how and why I started Chalkbeat Detroit in Detroit as a way. Chalkbeat is a network of local news sites covering education in different cities, and I had moved to Detroit, and I thought, well, I needed this information, and so lots of other parents probably did too. And educators needed information about the schools where they were working, and just people, policymakers, citizens. The schools are so important, and I wanted to be able to help them get information about schools, and schools that were going through, a really, significant change, and a lot of things are happening still.
Yeah, lots of yeah. My producer and I argue about schools a lot. He's a big proponent of charters, and I'm a public school educated kid myself all the way through, and so I'm not a big fan of charters. If I may, what decision did you end up making for your children?
I mean, my kids are in the public school system.
Okay.
I mean, my daughter went to one
Public
school.
school.
She went to one school for a couple of years, and it didn't work out. And we went to a different school, and both my kids are, and it's been really, challenging in terms of, how to find the right because all the schools in a lot of ways in Detroit, don't have the resources they should, and that, obviously that was really laid bare during the pandemic. I mean, it had been laid bare before the pandemic, but the pandemic, really just, made it so much more complicated. and just all the, all the different needs, all the needs that different families had even before became so much more intense. And the schools were one of the only institutions that were serving the needs of children.
Yeah.
And then they were closed. Almost all the schools in Detroit were essentially closed for a year and a half. My kids, my daughter didn't go to school for, a year and a half at all. I mean, she was in this remote school, which, was fine for her in some ways, but, also really not. No. So.
No. Okay. Question. I need to. I just thought of something. I have a story idea for you later. I have someone for you to meet. A professor at U of M Dearborn who has a project called the Best Classroom Project.
Oh yeah, I know her. I was.
You were part of that? Oh,
I was part of that. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay.
In fact, when I moved to Detroit, one of the first things I did was connect up with the Best Classroom Project, and I went on tours with them.
Okay. Oh.
And started touring schools. Yeah.
Small city. See, I love it. I love it. You already know Professor Dara Hill for our listeners, in case you didn't know. I had the pleasure of going to high school and undergrad with her, so. That is really cool that you did that. So one of the things I was curious about is, as a writer, what inspires you to write? What do you derive? How do you derive your inspiration? Because you're just not a reporter. You're an author as well. So you've written a book, and what is your writing style?
Well, that's two different questions.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's see.
Yeah.
What inspires I don't know. I don't know what inspires. I just feel like, I see stuff happening, and for me, I really like reporting because I get to go out and talk to people and ask them, and I was like, and I wasn't a very good student, for the most part, mostly because I can't, I have ADHD, right? And I can't like sit down and like read an academic paper,
Yeah.
I can try. I can read the, okay, you got to read the summary and the extract, whatever. Yeah. And you have to do that. But I like that I can then call up the author of the study and say, tell me about that study, because that's how I learn, and I love, and so what's great about reporting is this opportunity to really call people up and ask them about anything, tell me your story. And people have amazing stories when you stop and listen. So for me, and I'm always just, and then, I'll find something out and I'll be like, wait, what? No, that can't be right, and then you're like, well, how do I tell that story in a way that's going to make people care about it, that's going to, especially when you find out something that doesn't feel right, that feels like an injustice. And and you kind of feel like, well, if people knew about that, they would put an end to it, which doesn't always work out. Like you kind of hope that your work's going to have that impact.
If only they knew.
If only they knew. But I do think, ultimately, like over time, change is slow. But if I can tell the right story in the right way, and get it before the right audience, that maybe it can, at least influence policy in a positive way, and have some kind of a, positive influence on it. That was the first part of the question. What was the second part of the question?
How would you describe your writing style?
Oh, my writing style. I would describe my writing style as like, stream, like just blah. I put it all out there and then I try to organize it.
Okay. Get it out first, structure.
In fact, if I'm like having trouble writing a story, I sit down and I just start typing, and I'll just start writing whatever comes to my mind. Sitting here, I need to come up with a lead for the story. I don't know how I can, what's the lead? What should I write about? And then I just start writing. I just start, like, I'll start writing scenes, or, like I was out reporting and I saw this thing, and I'll sort of write that scene.
Okay.
And then, sometimes it ends up being the lead scene, and sometimes it ends up later on in the story.
That's pretty cool.
Sometimes it ends up just, slashed and gone. But I just sort of just keep writing until I have a story.
Okay. Do you journal?
Do I journal? A little bit. I used to. Like in high school and college, I journaled.
Okay.
Now I don't quite as much as I, but I try to,
Keep track of things. What advice would you have for an aspiring writer, either a reporter or author?
just write. I mean, that's the thing about, I mean, well, the beauty of writing is that it doesn't cost anything to write. You know, it doesn't have to be good, right? Like people are like, oh, I can't write, it's too bad. But it's also like, you know, like I mean, I wouldn't sing in public because I wouldn't do that to the, I mean, I cannot keep a tune. But I sing in the shower, you know, so like you know, so, or I sing, you know, at home, I sing in the car. My kids are always like, you know, like I'm singing along to the radio. My kids are like, Mommy, please stop. And I'm like, no. I like, you know, because it's, you know, so I mean, and the thing about writing is that, yeah, it's just, you just do it, you know, do it for posterity. I mean, and I, you know, like you mentioned my book. My book is a family history. It's, you know, my mother was a Holocaust survivor. She was a hidden child in Poland. And I went back essentially to fact check my family folklore, and I lived in Poland for a year. And I, in the process, found all these letters that people had written, and they were so valuable. So so what I would say is like, write, if nothing else, to build that historical record. You know, to write down what you're seeing. And people always think like, oh, nobody cares about me, or no one cares about somebody like me, or somebody, you know, in my situation, right? And they think like, oh, well, you know, I'm not a president, or I'm not a governor, or I don't have, you know. But ultimately, like when you do historical research, you know, I mean, certainly the archives of the president or the governor are important, but like that, like on the ground, like a journal. I mean, I did a story last year about the Burwood Wall, with the segregation wall in Northwest Detroit, and I wanted to go back and write and like find people who lived on both sides of the wall. And ultimately, I found this memoir that was written by this woman who had lived in that neighborhood her entire life, or most of her life. And she'd written, nobody, you know, and then the memoir is like at the Burton Historical Library in Detroit. You know, it's not something you would like, you know, find, you know, I mean, actually, you know what, actually, I bought it on Amazon, so you can buy it on Amazon.
Okay.
But it's not, you know, it's like an obscure thing, but because she sat, you know, she knew that her story was important.
Yeah.
And she sat down and she wrote this story, and if she hadn't, you know, I wouldn't have been able to discover that from my reporting in 2021. You know, yeah, my only advice for writers is just write. Whatever you have to say, you know, whether it's journaling or letters to your children or to your friends, or if it's an email. It doesn't have to be perfect penmanship, but like put it down.
Put it down, get it out.
Make a record. Yeah.
I was a history major in undergrad. One of my favorite things about the way the professors taught history was it was a very top down. They'd give you the papers for the president and the governors, whatever, but they'd also have you read letters from the small towns and things going on. So you got a really good perspective of those big high points in American history, but also you get a feel what the everyday man was going through and how life was affected by how those policies trickled down to regular people. And I found that was one of my favorite parts of history. It felt like it was story time every time I went to class. So that is a really good idea. One of the things I really was intrigued about and excited about in reading over your bio and your history is you've won a lot of awards. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm curious to know, what's been your proudest work so far? I know, tough one.
I mean, you know,
if there's anything,
I don't know. I'm probably the book. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, the book. It was a very personal story. So therefore, I think I invested years of my life in it, and you know, it was telling my mother's story, and my family story, and honestly, it's the story that inspired. I mean, the first time I told the story, my family's Holocaust story, was for my high school newspaper, the West Bloomfield High School Spectrum.
All right.
And it won like state high school, you know, journalism awards. And it was that moment where I was like, oh, right, like you can take this story and you can tell it in a way that's gonna, you know, engage people. And then I always, you know, wanted to kind of go back and fact check it and tell it in sort of a larger story. And what and I wasn't just telling the story from World War II. I was telling the story. I mean, I lived in Poland in 2001, and I was telling the story about what it looked like to go back at that time. You know, what sort of how the Jewish history of Poland was remembered by the Polish people in 2001. And of course I was there on 9/11, and so I watched 9/11. I watched like video of the towers falling from a bar in Krakow with a room full of people who had spent the day at Auschwitz, because like Auschwitz is the biggest tourist attraction in Krakow. And I mean, just imagine spending the day at Auschwitz and then coming back to your hotel and looking at the TV and seeing the towers falling. And you're just like, and this sort of connection between, sort of that war from the past and this one that is about to begin and ultimately last 20 years,
Wow.
Yeah.
That's got to be proud. Auschwitz is on my bucket list, the place to visit in life. Again, I'm a history major, so I want to see that stuff. So what's up next for you? Are you have any other books in the works or any other things like that? Any stories you're chasing? Can we scoop the national media here on the DDP?
I mean, I'm working on a couple of stories right now. I'm actually doing a fellowship next year through Columbia University, the Spencer Education Journalism Fellowship.
Okay.
And I'm going to be focusing on issues of exclusionary discipline in schools, so suspension and expulsion, and what it looks like, what happens in the lives of kids when they are exposed to that kind of discipline, and how that intersects with mental health, student mental health, youth mental health, and hopefully looking at programs that are doing a more effective job, because obviously we know that there's significant problems with suspension and expulsion, really contributing, there's extensive research on what happens to kids who are suspended and expelled, and they're far more likely to drop out of school, far more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. That kind of discipline is grossly disproportionate, really affecting, in particular, Black and Hispanic,
Males.
Usually boys, with like ADHD, like I have, like my kids have, right? Like the, kids with special needs, really disproportionately subjected to that, and really, really just, terrible consequences emerge from it. So I just want to really look at that issue and look at what we could do differently.
That's okay. That sounds like that's going to be
my
good
next
work.
big project. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to transition now to what we call our lightning round.
All
This
right.
is where we ask all of our guests a series of questions that are pretty much the same, and it's mainly about being in Detroit and your experiences in Detroit and around that stuff. But the first question is, how do you practice self-care?
How do I practice? I run. I walk the dog every day. I spend as much time outside as I can, particularly since the pandemic. Oh, I think I'm speaking too much for a lightning round.
No, you're
I try to spend time outside.
Okay. What are you reading?
I'm actually currently reading a former colleague of mine in Philadelphia broke the Jeffrey Epstein story, and she just wrote a book called Perversion of Justice, and it's sort of her story about how she, so it's sort of, I'm not particularly interested in Jeffrey Epstein, but
that story is, especially know someone who wrote it.
Yeah, so it's just kind of fun to sort of hear the story behind that story. It's sort of like it's investigative reporter, you like to read how everybody how they get that story, Okay,
that's cool. What are you listening to?
Oh, mostly a lot of podcasts. I don't, I mean, like I said, I'm in the car with my kids, and like I'm listening to Sing 2 in the car with the kids. And the Encanto soundtrack. But when I'm by myself, I'm mostly I listen to The Moth.
Okay.
This American Life.
I like the NPR stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, you got to add the DDP to your list.
I will add DDP, yeah. I listen to, like WDET, Detroit Today, like I do. I listen to a lot of local radio, mostly public radio.
Okay. NPR, I love NPR myself. What are you watching?
What am I watching? We were just watching the Mrs. Maisel. What's that called?
Marvelous
Mrs. Maisel, which I have some issues with, but it's pretty funny. This Is Us. It's not. I'm not all that like creative. I don't have anything like crazy. It's just like my.
If you have Netflix and haven't checked it out, but Becoming Anna
Oh, yeah?
Got me thinking investigative journalism. This is the story of the journalist who broke her story. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where do you like to go out to eat in the city?
Well, my birthday is this weekend, and we're going to have brunch at
27 again, yay.
Yeah, well, a little more than that, yeah. And we're going to have brunch with the whole family at Coriander Kitchen. And
Okay.
it's going to be springtime finally, I think. They've got this great location down on the canals on the east side.
Okay. Well, happy early birthday.
Thank you very much.
If you were, before COVID and going out and socializing in the city, where do you like to go socialize?
Where do I socialize in the city? I mean, honestly, the playground in my neighborhood is where I go. I mean, actually, but pre-pandemic, and I live in Lafayette Park. It's this great neighborhood, and pre-pandemic, every Friday night we'd all be out on the playground. We would get pizza, and we would figure out how many. We'd get a head count, and somebody would buy the pizza, and we'd have we had an oatmeal container that you put your cash in, people would bring beer or wine, and it would just be this standing block party. And I really hope it comes back this year because I've missed it.
That sounds really awesome. If a friend of yours is coming to town, what is something they absolutely have to do while they're here in Detroit?
I always take them down to the river walk. Like I said, I'm a runner, so DeKindercut, river walk. It's been so long. Honestly, it's like oh man, what did we do before the pandemic? But yeah, DIA, of course. You got to go see the murals, the frescoes. What are my other big Detroit spots? I mean, I always walk them into the lobby of the Guardian Building.
Okay.
Which I actually saw the first time, since this is a University of Michigan podcast.
Yes.
My senior year, I took a history of Detroit class.
Okay.
In the residential college. And he took us into the city. I can't remember if we took a van or we all drove or something, but he walked us into the lobby of the Guardian Building, and he said, look up. And you could see the ambitions of this city. You could see how the people of Detroit saw themselves. I don't know what year that building was built, maybe, I don't know, the 20s maybe?
Yeah.
And that, and it was, at a time when Detroit was just exploding in size. Detroit tripled in size between 1910 and 1930, and there was just so much money and so much wealth and so much hopes and dreams and people coming from everywhere, great migration and Eastern Europe and escaping pogroms, and they're all coming here with this great dream, and it was all kind of manifested on the ceiling of the Guardian Building. And I remember now, 30 years later, 25 years later, I remember that speech, and I repeat that speech whenever I have visitors come to town, and I take them into the Guardian Building and I tell them to look up.
I might have to go back to the Guardian Building. Okay. Last question is, where can we find you?
I mean, I'm a reporter for NBC News. You can find my work on NBCnews.com. Mostly that's where you find me. You find me on this podcast. You can watch this over and over and over again.
Cool. Well, thank you for joining us today. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Erin Einhorn, NBC reporter. I want to thank you for coming in today. Really appreciate seeing you again. Fellow East Quader.
Yeah.
I wasn't in the RC, but I lived in East Quad for 3 years. So, again, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This has been the latest episode of the Distinctly Detroit podcast. You can get us wherever you get your pods. Please subscribe, rate, and like. And tune in next time. Thank you all. Thank you for listening to the Distinctly Detroit podcast. This is a production of the University of Michigan Detroit Center, and you can find us anywhere you get your pods. Please rate, review, and subscribe. This podcast is directed and produced by Marlon Franklin, edited by Taylor Henniger, with writing contributions by James Neely and Leah Allen. Thank you for listening.